Welcome to West Stow Anglo-Saxon Village here in the heart of Suffolk. This is an amazing, unique site where we know our ancestors lived. We've focused our efforts here at West Stow on the early Anglo-Saxon period, a period of history often known as the Dark Ages, complicated due to the lack of written word, the fact these people built with wood and thatch, and this material has long since rotted away. So I feel it's our job here to try and recreate the past and help people understand their ancestors. West Stow is much older though. This location, this settlement, right on the area of the River Lark, is very important to people. It means self-sufficiency. So it wasn't just the Anglo-Saxons who found this a special place. It's been used by many people. The earliest times, we think, is about 10,000 years ago. These hunter-gatherers staying on the hill, camping overnight and tracking animals along the River Lark. After that, we know it was settled by the Celts, and they lived on this site for almost 300 years, farming, working the landscape, trading with local people. Masses have changed. The Romans arrived in the area, and these people, the Romans, came to this site to make pottery and were here for several hundred years. So again, the Romans realised the importance of this site. The River Lark, again, good for trade and transport. All around this area's pathways, people had got used to trade, so the Romans found it a site they could use and probably trade and work with the local people. At the end of the Roman period, though, life became very difficult. People in this country, the Romano-Britons by then, had really realised that Roman life wasn't too bad and civilization seemed to suit them. This all started to crumble away. As the Roman army started to leave, chaos it seems, or so we were told. But I think what happens then is that we know these Angles and Saxons, these people from Germany, Denmark and Holland, started to travel here, settle on the landscape, work with the locals and set up what we call the kingdom of the Eastern Angles. This way life spread and helped form more kingdoms that became Anglesland or England. So we think this is one of the first English villages in this country and a place to visit. What I hope to do with you is take you around our unique site, give you an insight into the life of these early Saxon people, show you some of their skills, their crafts, their homes, and maybe, just maybe, what it could have been like here 1,500 years ago. I will say this is an experimental site. Things we've tested haven't worked. New ideas come and go. So what we try and do is give our visitors and people who like this period of history a chance to find out for themselves. So on the journey, I'll show you the highlights of West Stow, the Anglo-Saxon village. So firstly, I think we need to talk about the settlement. The actual archaeology on this site was done mainly between 1965 and 1972 and was excavated right across this whole area, beyond the trees at the back, over to the far end and all the way down to the bottom of the hill where our pigs are today and we do our farming project. This was actually excavated for over 8 seasons and Dr. Stanley West and his team worked very hard to excavate what was seen to be a typical Anglo-Saxon settlement. Many of these sites have been found around this part of East Anglia and into Europe. But this site was unique. The evidence at West Stow really helped us gain some new ideas about how people lived. Before that, some quite bad ideas had got their way into history books and drawings, and people had started to think this was an age of barbaric people because of the Romans being so civilised before them. And houses like the one behind me, the sunken house, is seen as the kind of idea of what people lived in. Very crude, very basic. Before I tell you about this building though, about the location, because it is important, we are by, as I said before, the River Lark, which is just here to the south of us. This would have run around this area to make sure that people could trade, travel and use the communications with people in the area. Also, to this side, we're going towards the areas of footpaths, which we know date back right the way through to the Neolithic period, so already good trade links. And this site we call Stow, which means a special place. And it must have been special to them because it was all about using the landscape. Woodlands, farmlands, and again, as I've mentioned, trade links. This was a time when people didn't use money, so they had to be able to use what was nearby to them. And this is where our structures come into the story. These houses made with wood and thatch and local materials. But the sunken house behind me is a problem building for us. We call it a sunken house. It's known as SFBs, or sunken featured buildings. Archaeologists usually find a pit or bowl shape in the soil when they excavate. And for many years it was seen that the people would dig these holes to live inside, the structure being earth walls and a flat earth floor. Archaeology also finds post hole evidence. Now, post holes would be the structures that held the building up. The problem for us is that's all usually the evidence left behind. The houses made of wood and thatch, long since rotted away. So everything you see here above ground at West Stow is reconstruction work, ideas, but based on good understanding, working with tools and equipment and the experts. This building we think is wrong for our period of history now. We no longer think people lived in the pit under the structure. We think the pit was for a different purpose, which I'll tell you about later on the tour when we get to the other houses. But our sunken house is here to show people what we used to think. And we think that's very important to make sure you get your own ideas of this period of history. We are talking about early 5th century, about 420 AD we think for West Stow, right through to the 7th century, about 700 AD probably. Again, you'll hear me say probably, maybe, ifs, buts and could be's because we don't know. There is a lack of written word after all. The evidence in the soil sometimes can be interpreted in different ways. But our sunken house, when you go inside, you'll see is a very barren, bare space. We're not comfortable with putting furniture and objects inside because we don't want people to think anyone lived inside it. We don't want people to actually think a building of this type was at West Stow, but it's here to tell the story of an old idea. We've found that actually when it rains, the roof does its job too well. The water will run down the side and shed, get to the sides and make its way back in. So even on a dry day, this can be damp inside from the moisture overnight. We've also found where the thatch touches the ground, it gets a lot of rodent and insect problems, and this can lead to the thatch not surviving as long as you'd expect. You'll see at the front of the building gaps in the walls. Now, we would not want to make people think that there was no skill in those times. These people were shipbuilders and quite often travelling the seas. They surely knew how to put wood together. But what's happened over time is the wood has shrunk, gaps have appeared. Maybe caulking, maybe filling those gaps was a part of their understanding of woodworking, but we feel their technology and skill would have been much better from the tools that have been found. So this is an example of what happens with poor construction. The wood pulls apart. I must admit the only thing I do like about this building is the superb carving around the doorway, based on some Anglo-Saxon artwork found. These interlocking snakes, very much like what you might see in the Celtic period of history, just shows that maybe people were keen on decorating their homes. Unfortunately at West Stow, wood hasn't survived, so we've got no wooden carvings, but actually on the brooches, the beads, on many of the objects we've got fine detail, dots and rings, curves and swirls, artistic styles, and maybe that's what the people, if they had time, would have put onto their buildings. I feel they would have done. Cave dwellers thousands of years before were cave painting, modern day people obsessed with redecorating, so I think somewhere in between people may have got round to decorating their home. So when it comes to our sunken house, we feel it's wrong mainly because it encourages the wrong elements into the building, the cold and the damp. It fills over time, so with use the pit gets filled, and that means fire is a problem because you need a fire and the fire would get too close to the roof and maybe cause problems. So we're summarising the sunken house at West Stow really is saying that we think it's wrong for this soil type, for this area. Some archaeologists believe that these sunken houses can work and do work in certain regions, but at West Stow we think it's wrong. It's alongside, in the background, what we call the oldest house at West Stow. Now that building was the first one made on site to test the new ideas of living above ground. The ideas that there was a floor over the pit, walls and a thatched roof. So these two work well together to show old and new. This building was actually built in 1976 after the first works to try and give people their own choice, to look at the different ideas in archaeology and different ideas in experimental archaeology. A big difference. So the oldest house now is unfortunately you can't go inside it because of its age. It's over 30 years old, the building has started to lean Rot has got into the posts. In fact, we excavated the posts a few years ago and there's nothing left but just mush. And that's true of what would happen to the wood in the ground. So this building now is mainly used as a storage area for some of our crops to use on the roof for repairs and for our pottery when it's drying. The Saxons may well have done the same until that building was taken down, those pieces of wood reused around the site. In front of the building we've got a small area which we do crops inside, growing herbs, but also one of the key points is an outside bread oven. Now unfortunately we live in the 21st century and health and safety rules have changed, so some of the work we do has to be outside to facilitate our staff and the visitors who come to see our place at West Stow. So we have a small bread oven which we do use from time to break bread and to show people what life was like in those times, and our reenactors come here to live sometimes and that's the bread oven they will use. Maybe these were inside the building, used in a different way. They had their own health and safety 1,500 years ago. They have understood the needs. But here at West Stow, many of our skills and work we do outside in the open air. So we've just looked at two buildings there, the old idea of the sunken house where people lived underground, and moving on to the new ideas of people living above ground on floors, more like a home. What I'd like to do now is take you on the tour to the weaving house to give you an idea of crafts on site and making cloth for the family groups. So we're going to go this way. So we're now inside the weaving house at West Stow, and what we're trying to show here is that these people were self-sufficient again and using the landscape around them to help with their everyday lives. Weaving must have been a very important part of the social structure of this Saxon village because some of their houses seem to be giving over to the production of cloth, and that's exactly what we're showing here in this building. So when it comes to weaving sheds or weaving houses, they look like a place to maybe during the evening store the material, and behind me is a loom machine, probably typical of the style of that period of history. Now this is where I'll have to go back to the fact that we've got a lack of evidence because, as you may notice, it's a wooden frame with cloth, so this would have rotted away. But luckily ideas like this have passed down through the generations and we've got evidence for later versions. So our one, we think, would have been used in the 5th and 6th century here at West Stow. But it looks like it was a small domestic industry. Inside these houses was the production of cloth. Now the landscape around them meant that they had certain dyes, plants that could help give them rich colours. We're trying to get away this idea of these people walking around in just leather or with animal furs and very dull colours, which the old history books show us. We go for vibrant colours, a whole range of reds and blues and yellows, which could be achieved with the plants and the herbs of the time. So what we're trying to show in this building then is that the people worked together, and the idea of this sense of community, and making cloth must have been very important for trade, because making bright coloured cloths may excite traders who come here, trading maybe bits of metal or silverware or even the latest jewellery coming in from Europe. So we get a sense of people working together again, maybe inside during a poor weather day. They couldn't take the looms outside where the sun was shining, so maybe they sat in here by a small fire working the various looms. When it comes to the production of cloth, we're talking a labour, a long time, a drawn out process. You've got to have the sheep, so there we get to farming, working the landscape again. So you've got the wool, which you bring to this building, and maybe outside it's washed and rinsed, the wool brought inside and stored in baskets. From that stage, you might need to start to think of dyeing materials or spinning to threads. And these threads then obviously would have helped to move towards the actual production of the cloth once it was on the loom machine. So within a family group, we're looking at houses to live in, halls for meetings, which we'll look at later, and the weaving shed. And we've only rebuilt at West Stow one family group. And from our evidence, there was at least 2 or 3 family groups on the hill at West Stow, and each seemed to have something like a weaving building. The one I'm standing in is reconstructed on the site of what we call SFB 19. Sunken featured building number 19 on the site's evidence. But it's actually based on another building, SFB 15, which we moved to this location because that actually burnt down in Anglo-Saxon times. And it's the evidence from these burnt down structures that's helped us go away from the idea of living in a pit, the sunken house which we saw earlier. We're now looking at floorboards and walls made of oak and thatched roofs higher up to give more space. So the burnt down weaving house was a great example of how a building may have physically looked above ground. So you've got the pit covered with floors, the walls, which again allow for more work inside, And with the roof higher up, great for storage, allowing the smoke to rise from the fire and making the building more usable. And this one, weaving. Other buildings, homes, other buildings, storage. These clues often come from what's found in the soil. And underneath this building, where it burnt down, lots and lots of loom weights. And at the bottom of our weaving frames, you'll see these very much donut-shaped weights, often made of clay. Some were fired, some were unfired, some decorated, some chalk. They used the materials again around them. Some of the more decorative ones show that maybe they enjoyed their craft, enjoyed their job, and added that little bit of style to their work. But these weaving looms, unlike the wood and thatch, survived the fire. As the house started to burn intensely, the wood collapsed in on top of the floors. The fire increased and those dropped into the pit below. And sandwiched in between was the evidence of the loom weights. And in this particular building, they were scattered all around the edges, which suggested maybe 2-3 different loom machines in the building, as well as other ones stored. Our loom weights, I must admit, get damaged in this modern day age, just with use and handling and people wanting to look at them, and they are quite fragile. In Anglo-Saxon times, again, they were probably important parts of the family group use, and so they worked well with them and cared for them. And the spare ones may have been stored to the side. And that's maybe suggested in the fire where we found extra ones on top of each other. So just to go back to this weaving house idea, we don't know how long they spent in the weaving house. We don't know how long they would have gone outside to work on a sunny day. There were so many other jobs to do around the village. But cloth production, I feel, personally, would have been very important. In our museum on site, lots of loom weights, weaving tools, needles and pins, things to do sewing and stitching. And I think they had pride in what they were making on this site. About cloth again and colour, well, we've got a lack of evidence. So much of this material has rotted away. We have a few examples surviving again at West Stow, but not whole outfits. But we're suggesting that, again in a weaving house, squares of material were made on the looms, which were then passed over to be sewn together to make kirtles and trousers and peplos dresses, which would have been the fashion of the time. We're not sure about if anyone lived in a building like this, because we feel it was just there to be storage, maybe use on a cold, wet weather day, and the job's taken outside when it was sunny, as I've mentioned before. So weaving houses may have been a part of the family group of houses, a place to work, and a place to make that extra material, as I mentioned before, for trade. Also, when it comes to this building, it's about techniques. It is an experimental site. We are unsure how the walls were put together and the different styles of thatching. And as you'll notice as you go around this journey with me, we've tried different styles of thatching, different wall techniques, locks for the doors, windows. All these, I must admit, are experimental archaeology. We have no evidence for this large space of light. But again, about its functionality, it's very difficult to do some of these detailed work on a wet weather day inside here without a window space. Again, this 21st century attitude comes in. We feel more light's needed for health and safety. Maybe the Anglo-Saxons, a smaller light gap space. Maybe more light coming in through the doorway, candles burning and the use of the fire. But that's the thing about West Stow. We have to balance the needs of 21st century with the needs of the past. But we feel if you have a gap in the wall where the light comes in, you've got to cover it somehow. So in this building, we have a way of covering the window at night. Maybe animal skins were used, maybe different latch systems, question upon question. But that's the problem with this dark age period of history. The fun side of it is we get to try different techniques and different ideas and learn from them. This building was rethatched only 2 years ago because finally after about 20 years the thatch started to come apart and was causing the building to have water getting in. This particular style in here is known as fleeking, and our master thatcher comes here a couple of seasons to just work with us and help us find out a bit more about how the thatching styles could have changed or how the materials could have been used. This particular one I like because I have done a small piece of thatching on site before, quite hard work with the hands, but this material works well with you, and the interlocking and lacing of the thatch means that you get a tight weave, very good to obviously protect the building. And that's a part of our work at West Stow, to continue to repair, re-evaluate, look at what we've done before, learn lessons when things have gone wrong, and carry on doing things which seem right to us. The last thing to mention about this building, before we move on, is the fact that it's a classic two-post structure. When we go around the site together, we'll find that there's 6 posts and 2 posts, very unique to this East Anglian area. But this two-post structure gives an air of space inside, maybe again to utilise the space needed for people working together. The next building we'll look at is a 6-post structure, and again gives an idea of smaller space, maybe more secluded areas within the building, possibly a home. So we're now made our way through the site to what we would call the living house. Now the living house is an example of what we feel is a home for an Anglo-Saxon family. This is where we get into the difficulty of exactly what was a family, how many people were in the family home. Again, the lack of written word doesn't help us here. But our feeling is, based on the site, the news and information that passes down from people and how people may have lived through the ages, we kind of go along the line of maybe a family of up to 10 may have shared this kind of space. It doesn't seem very big compared to our modern day lifestyle, but actually this space would have been well used. What we're looking at then is a home for a family of 10. This building is a 6-post house, and this is the difference between this and the weaving house, which I mentioned earlier, being a 2-post structure. You can see they're closely formed, and this means the house is divided up. Behind me is a bed. We also have tables, a raised bench area, firebox, a suggestion of how the home could have been laid out. We're not sure how this really would have happened, but this is our sense of home and community again. People sitting around the fire in the evening. Bedrooms at night, well, maybe furs and blankets to sleep on. Maybe mum and dad or the head of the family had their own bed in the corner. These are all suggestions, but it gives us the right kind of feeling for family life. What we're trying to do at West Stow is give people the opportunity to think for themselves. So as you enter the living house, you look around and see the framework really first. 6-post house, vertical walling, floors with gaps so you can look at the pit, which I'll tell you more about in a moment. The firebox, which we try during the days to keep the fire going a little bit, to add that smell and sense of home. What we try and then do is suggest areas, like I've said, the bed behind me. Now, if you were to actually sit on this bed today, you'd find it very hard and uncomfortable, and maybe think that people in the past were, well, difficult people, because this is a difficult space. But actually, not at all. What we're trying to show then is the space. But if you lived here, more furs, more blankets, beds, pillows, it would have been a comfortable night's sleep, especially after a hard day working outside. And that leads me again about outside. This is a small space, and most of your time would have been spent outside those doors, going out to the woodlands, working the landscape, working the place around you. This may have been used just to return to at night to sleep in. Maybe it was a space that some family members sat by the fire doing various works and jobs. By the fire, in the good light, you could have been doing repairs to weaving. We've mentioned the weaving house as being a place where they did that kind of work, but there's no reason to think in their own homes they didn't do repairs to their fishing nets, maybe repaired a tear to a trouser that would have been used out on the farmland that day by a member of the family. So the light from the fire would have been very important to this family group. What's interesting about fires is that we find evidence of fireplaces in the buildings, but they're not directly in the middle. This building is a good example. We call this house SFB5 in its historical reference, Sunken Featured Building number 5, and it's got a clear evidence of a fire area towards the north wall, which is this side of the building. So it's not directly as you come in, but towards the darker side of the house, maybe because it was the colder part of the building. But it gives a sense of people sitting around that area. Over here we have a raised bench. Now this is one of those problems where we're unsure how the building was used. Viking longhouses often had this tendency to have 2 raised areas either side of the doorways as you came in. We're kind of going along this idea with the Anglo-Saxons, and in this building we try out the idea of benches, tables, beds. But this side we've gone for a raised area that could have been for a loom, it could have been for storage, it could have also been, just as I said, for a sleeping area. Maybe up to 8 people could have slept up there. From time to time at West Stow, reenactors, people who can live this period of history and enjoy this period of history, often come here to stay. And this is a building they particularly like. It does give that sense of home, which we're trying to get. And with the furs and blankets and pillows, cooking going on, smoke rising, they actually say it's a very nice environment. Back to its structure though, this is a different style of walling. One thing we try and do at West Stow is not repeat the same idea because we don't learn from it. So it's about testing ideas. So we experimented on this building by testing tangential splitting. Now what this means is, instead of cutting a tree in half and then cutting that into quarters and eighths and sixteenths, the walls here have been done in a different way, more like planking for flooring. These are butted together with a groove inside, and inside that groove little fillets to fill in the gaps. Now you may notice some gaps appearing, but this building is well over 25 years old and you'd expect some shrinkage, and that could be clogged with a few little pieces of heather or maybe mud and clay. We've found though in our experiments that sometimes these tests prove that things may have been too difficult, and doing it this way makes it feel as though it's maybe just too much work for that time in that period of history. So when we look at the other buildings around the site, we can go more back to the idea of radial split work, which is basically this idea of segments, and these triangle pieces fit together quite comfortably and with shrinkage still overlap. That gives us a feeling of using the tools of the time. And when working on these buildings, we are using things that they had, things like the small axe, the adze, and also the auger, a particular item which was for drilling holes in the wood. On the floors and around the building, our houses are put together using the spoon auger to drill the hole and a wooden peg banged in to hold the floor and buildings together. What's interesting as well is they're square pegs into a round hole. Now this is something that obviously people sometimes struggle with, but actually as this green oak peg is banged into another piece of oak, it rounds off and bites. We've found that if we use a round peg in a round hole, over time it shrinks and it comes loose. So actually these tests can help us learn a bit more about the past. The last thing to mention about the living house is actually the thatched roof. This is where we're using ideas of thatching on top of old thatch. So the roof in here is actually Norfolk reed, and we've kept the original base coat, which is over 25 years old, and raked off the top coat that started to rot. And with funding and help, we've actually put another layer on top of spelt wheat, and this is a good idea to cover up the old thatch, preserve, and hopefully show an idea of people working with materials over time. So we're now going to make our way over towards the farmer's house, which is similar to this building, but more about a wealthy family of that period of history. So we're now inside what we call SFB 12. Again, on the site archaeological plan, each house was given a location number. What's interesting about SFB 12, or the farmer's house as the public get to know it here at West Stow, is that it's had quite a history since it's been on the site. It's actually got the deepest pit found at West Stow. Now this is getting this idea that people weren't living inside them, but maybe using them for another reason. It was the only building on site that suggested having lined walls, maybe of oak panels. This could be a cellar. And actually behind me is a cellar door. Again, another idea that people may have gone into this location for storage of pots, maybe keeping food cool. We don't know. In fact, over the next few months, we'd like to do some experimental tests to see about temperature and how things could be stored in this location. But the actual building itself has gone through some trials. It was burnt down by vandals in 2005, after many years of putting the building together. Now, most people would have seen this as a really bad thing, and of course at the start we did, because we'd lost one of our most important structures on site. The reason it's important? Well, it was suggesting wealth and status. The reason for that, we wanted to show that people that visited West Stow, we weren't talking about barbarians living underground in hovels, but families and communities living and working together, and some of them with a bit of wealth and style, and that's what we suggested with this building. But in 2005, after the building had been completed and been used by reenactors and visitors for some years, it was burnt down overnight. And in the morning all we found was the burnt debris of the wood, the thatch, and everything had collapsed into the pit. The good thing about this, we found, was it matched what happened 1,500 years ago. If you recall me talking about two houses burning down on the site, that helped us work out that they had floors and walls. So actually this burnt down part of the building evidence could be reused again, but in a 21st century way. Whereas before we couldn't prove where things were located before the fire, we had photographs and evidence. So the building pretty much has been rebuilt as it was before, but we did a lot of work experimenting and actually digging the site up like it was a real site. So we had experimental archaeologists, teams of archaeologists, digging away at the burnt timbers, seeing exactly how much survived the fire, and corresponding that with the evidence of the original fires on site. It's helped us in some ways get a knowledge of how close we are to proving these Anglo-Saxon houses were above ground, more like the homes that we're trying to show here at West Stow. Since then, it's been rebuilt, and what we're trying to show here again is this idea of a home for a family, but a higher status. In this building we have a spear on display and a shield set. It might suggest a man showing off that he's a warrior class, again very important amongst a group of farmers. Again, about how people lived on the site, we still don't really know, but the objects for this building showed a little bit of wealth. The things that maybe had dropped through the floorboards and stayed behind, bits of silver, nice brooches, even larger pottery, all suggest maybe status. Behind me, a raised area. Again, just an idea because it leaves no archaeological evidence, but maybe a wealthier family had more items to store. Maybe food was stored in the rafters to be smoked, bags of meat would be good for this. Antlers to make the bone tools they needed and required to maybe do work on the site as well. Back to the actual structure, it's another 6-post building. As you find, the posts in here are quite chunky, quite thick and rigid. Again, there's some difficulty here because the post hole evidence doesn't allow us to know exactly the size of a post, and we are on the bigger chunky side for health and safety, holds the structure up. Maybe in Anglo-Saxon times you had to rely on the resources around you, the woodlands nearby. So out in the woodlands, looking for the timbers you needed to build a structure like this, you'd have to know the wood, you'd have to know how to cut it, treat it, axe it, shape it. We take the bark off because we don't want the bugs and mites to stay behind. So it is about making the buildings last as long as they could. And here's another problem for us. We honestly don't know how long the Saxon buildings lasted before they felt it was time to move away from that location. Back to the oldest house, it's over 35 years old, leaning badly. Maybe that was the lifespan of a Saxon building after the post holes and started to kind of cause problems for the building. For this one, it's still quite new. In fact, it's the newest build at West Stow, completed in about 2007. So we've not finished it yet. We've got the thatch on, we've got the posts in place, the floorboards are in place, we've got the fire working now, just a little firebox next to me, but it actually isn't kitted out quite like we'd want to show the visitors. Our ideas for this building is to show status, so we may well have a posher bed. Bed burials have been found for this area, and maybe going to the afterlife with something like this piece of furniture would just show a bit of status. So the bed will go in the corner and maybe quite decorative compared to the one we saw in the living house, just a box with furs and blankets. Also, we want to put more metalwork in this building because actually that's a sign of wealth and power. Maybe hanging from the roof space, maybe a chain. On that would be the cooking pot and the family again having their own space to cook around the fire. Interesting about our fireboxes, this is another problem we have at West Stow. We can't quite match the idea of how their fires would have worked compared to ours. Health and safety, again, kicking in. We may have had the idea that they had stones with clay over the top as a pad on the floor and the fire sat on top. We did try this in some of the early constructions, but as people came in, the floorboards moved, the clay pad cracked and the debris started to go inside. So that was too much of a risk for us. So what you'll find at West Stow are fire boxes. These are wooden boxes filled with clay and soil, and the fire sits on top. And with care and attention, there's absolutely no problem. Going back to the fire for SFB 12, it wasn't this that led to the fire and burning down the house. It was vandals coming in late at night when no one was here. So with fires inside wooden buildings, as long as you look after them, they'll look after you. So again, this building, a seat of prestige maybe for a family group. Maybe it was the head family that had a building of this size. The building we'll go to next is actually the hall, and the hall is a special building as it's the centre of the family group. So I'm now going to be entering the hall at West Stow through the east entrance. Now what's interesting about the hall buildings is they often had two doorways. This may have been because we're looking at a family group area where Maybe up to 30 people may have come to sit for the evening storytelling. I'll come back to how they may have used the hall in a moment. I just want to quickly talk about the actual structure itself. It's very different from the other buildings at West Stow. Most of the houses are very small, compact buildings, again for storage, weaving houses, homes to live in. The hall's bigger, a space maybe where this family group could come together. At West Stow, the archaeologists found over 70 structures on the site which looked like SFBs, and then some buildings which were larger, which we've now called halls, about 7 on the site. And this is the site of one of those halls where we've reconstructed this building. It's a different build in the way that there's no inner posting to getting our way. There would normally be one right here where I'm standing. So it's not a 6 or 2 post structure, but the posts are in the walls. It's basically a box, earth fast, to open up the space. This is the second hall we've made at West Stow. The one previous to this we had to take down. It's one of those things about experimental archaeology. You test an idea, over the years you see something might not work. And the building then started to lean. For many years it had a buttress at the side to hold the building in place. But it was decided in 2000 to take the hall down, rebuild it, because it is meant to be the centre of the family group and may have had that more effort put towards making it look better than the houses around it. So our hall at West Stow is the centre of this family group. And we're suggesting there may have been 2, maybe 3 family groups at West Stow, so maybe 2 to 3 halls in use at any one time. We don't think it's the big grand hall as a community centre. The village itself was ordinary farmers. Maybe the seat of power in the area, the Thane or the local lord, may have had a bigger hall. But the villagers at West Stow may have used this building for many purposes. The thing about the structure as well, it feels bigger. There's more space, the roof space above much higher up. In this building is a good example of showing you where the smoke leaves the building, and we're suggesting it's at the side. We've got a central fire. As the smoke rises, it gets to the top of the roof and fans out to the edges and out the holes in the side of the roof, not through a hole in the middle. Again, with experimental work, we can test these ideas. Places where they've tried the hole in the middle of the roof have caused problems. The smoke goes out, but the weather gets in. The thatch can deteriorate around the hole in the roof, and also the sparks can get drawn up, and that's another big problem in the building. So you may see pictures in old history books showing Saxon houses, halls with a hole in the roof and the smoke filtering through. We don't think that's right here. So again, this is a good example of giving an idea of where the smoke would leave. But the space above, I think again, storage, not for living in. Back to the purpose of the hall, it's difficult. There are many different points of view here. Some archaeologists say it's a central building as a sleeping area, so the families would all sleep here, and the buildings around it were actually the storage areas and work shelters. Again, the archaeology at West Stow suggests a building, the centre of the family group, but not a home. Evidence here may be things like dice and gaming counters. It might be a place for families to come together. There wouldn't have been much time to actually have fun, as we call it today. Most of their life would have been on the land working, collecting things from the woodlands, trade. We keep away from the idea of aggression and fighting because there is a lack of written records for this, but I'm sure there were difficult times. So those moments in the day or the evening where they could come together as a social group, maybe tell stories like Beowulf, Grendel, the creation story perhaps, maybe tell poetry, or even just go through a group of riddles to have fun for the evening. This could have been a centre for those operations, those times of life where you just want to sit back and listen. We have a chair here which could have been used for the head family member, be it man or woman. It could also have been handed over to the storyteller. Maybe he would have got everyone together to listen to those grand stories. Our hall's quite plain when it's a normal visit, but when reenactors come to live here, wall hangings, shields, spears, the drinking horn hanging, adds that extra idea of it could have been quite a fun place to be. So this may have been a room for also serious meetings. Maybe the elders got together here to discuss how the crops were growing, when the trader was coming next, or problems within the family groups. So this may have been a place for those problems to be solved. But these are all ideas because there's no written record. But you have to have a sense of understanding the site when you work here or come to visit. Think about the hall. I go along the idea of sitting in here in the evening listening to Beowulf. And Beowulf's such an important story for us because it gives us a glimpse at the past, this period of history. It describes Grendel the monster bursting through the hall door. Well, that's great because we don't find hall doors because they've rotted away. So it allows us to experiment and test. Actually, this hall door at West Stow has got a great lock system. Bone antler keys were found at West Stow, so we know technology, locking mechanisms would have been here. So it gives us a chance to test out how they looked after their buildings. So we're now going to go on to the last part of the tour now, the final building, which we call the workshop, and it's the later part of the site's history, just before they started to abandon the site and move away. So we're entering another style of building at West Stow now, which we call the workshop. It's very different because most of the structures at West Stow are wooden constructions, wooden walls, wooden floors, thatched roofs. Now those elements are still here with the thatched roof and wooden post areas, but you'll clearly see it's a wattle and daub style building. Now wattle and daub being a framework of hazel or willow battens, and then on top of that, daubed over the top, a mixture of materials. It can be manure, hair, horsehair, animal hair. It can be grit and stone and mainly clay. This is then thrown on both sides, bonded together, and as it dries you get a nice solid wall. There's not much evidence for this style of building at West Stow, but we know there was this kind of building during this period of history. We've got some wattle panels that may have survived on the site. Middle Saxon structures were often of this technique. In fact, only a few miles away from here, a location called Brandon, there was more Saxon sites found, and a lot of the buildings were wattle and daub, and that's why we've chosen this style to be our workshop at West Stow. With experimental archaeology, you want to try out different techniques, so this building was allowing us to show what could be done with the resources around you. The Anglo-Saxons to the north of this village of Stow actually had a clay area, and they would have had to go to that area to dig the clay up to bring back to the village to work. We use the building as a workshop, and inside here different crafts are taken place. In front of me is a pole lathe machine. Lack of evidence again for this site, but the Romans used them, and we're sure that the Anglo-Saxons working with the Roman army would have used something like a pole lathe machine. It's a pedalled machine that as it's spun and turned, you can then carve bowls, cups, chair legs, lots of things. And evidence of bowls like this have been found in some peat bog areas where they've survived. So really this building just is there to show visitors what can be done with the materials and resources around you. And it's the later part of this period of history. So just to summarise this workshop building, it's not the kind of building that we think the people of West Stow would have had, but it's certainly the kind of building they would have left West Stow and maybe moved towards building. And also they would have taken skills like the pole lathe with them to carry on their skilled work with wood. So we've come to the end of our journey at West Stow, and what you've seen is a collection of buildings that we would call a family group. It's not quite an Anglo-Saxon village, that would be 20, maybe 30 buildings. The site itself is unique because it has been built exactly on the site of the original Anglo-Saxon settlement, and I hope we're doing justice to the people that lived here 1,500 years ago. Who were these people? I'm not sure if we really will ever know, but we're getting closer to understanding them. These were ordinary farming folk living off the land, coming from Germany, Denmark and Holland. Settlers, not invaders, people who came to settle and work with the people that were already here. Romano-British life had broken down, and these people came in and took that challenge on, worked off these special places, places like Stow. They were here for probably 200 to 300 years on this particular site before they gradually abandoned the site. We don't know why. It could have been the coming of Christianity, new faith, new ways. Money, people meant they could earn money and maybe get a better life for themselves away from the village. Towns were appearing, so the draw of those things may have made small places like West Stow become abandoned. The people, well, they ended up being the first English, in this area, England, so they've never left us. West Stow, I think, is a truly remarkable place. It's more than just these houses on the actual site. There's lots of things to see and do here. Our visitor centre has lots more information about the life of the Anglo-Saxons and also the people that lived here before them and helped set up this part of the country. We've also got our magnificent Anglo-Saxon centre, which displays the real objects from this site: combs, brooches, beads, belt buckles, ordinary things left behind, some buried with the dead from the cemetery. But these are glimpses at the past and they have a story to tell. So a visit to West Stow is a chance to visit a part of the people of the kingdom of the Eastern Angles, East Anglia as we call it today, that helped form England as we know it. It's a unique place, a wonderful place. They called it Stow, which means a special place.